Okay, so let's see what we find when we go to investigate our Queen's Gambit. We're going to create new game here and go to infinite analysis, and let's start with, say, d4, d5. And you might be looking at this from the black side, but I'm following the convention of showing positions from the white side. And here we have the Queen's Gambit. Now, there are other moves that you might encounter as black that start with d4. They are a lot less common at higher levels, but you'll find them in chess clubs and so forth. They're the London system, Tory attack, the Trompowsky, there's the Stonewall. There's several what I would call second string openings that you will not find in top level games, but yet they're still not easy to just refute as long as you have an opponent who knows something about them. So I'm going to look at this e6 move first, as this is the most common way for black to decline the gambit. But before I do, I want to look at this idea of taking the pawn, because this is something that beginners worry about, especially if they are the white pieces. They feel like, well, why not take this free pawn? Well, first of all, know that it's not a free pawn. It's not a free pawn. Is it a mistake for black to take it, as I said a moment ago? No, it's not. So let's have a look at the stats first here. And .com, that's CHRISCHESS.com. And this is going to be the beginning of a series on how to play closed openings. A lot of this will be for players of the black pieces, as most beginners ought to start with e4 for a first move. However, it will instruct both sides. So, in this first segment, I'm going to look where a lot of people, and let's go to against e4, which is 38% wins. Also, white gets an extra 2% in draws. See, black wins 39% for white. That leaves e4. Black with a worse profile than against e4, but remember, these statistics here come from games between masters, so and that's why you can't worry. They really shouldn't be given too much sway. But of course, d4 is not a mistaken move. This is a move black often makes, and pretty much 100% of what you find at amateur level. Anytime I've had a kid student who plays d4, virtually all of his opponents, until they're over 1400 or so, they always respond with d5. And d5 is a perfectly playable response by black, as is any black move that takes control of e4 immediately, such as f5 or knight f6. Other moves are not as good, and also allow black to transpose into other things. Other black moves here on black's first move might leave white transposing into something else. For instance, sometimes black likes to play this, but he also, if he plays the French defense against e4, he may play this, and most d4 players know that, so they'll just play c4 to avoid it. But if you don't mind playing against the French defense and you think your opponent maybe doesn't know that, you might go here now, especially if he's one of these people like me who plays e4 and d4. I think I would rather play e4 here as white. But if you're the black pieces, you can't expect that. So d5 is a common move. Let's go back one move and see what the numbers look like for d5, just in case. I mean, it really, when they're very close to one another like this, you really should just ignore them. They don't mean anything for amateur level games. But in terms of popularity, they mean even less, because this is popularity among master players. This is not all the games on chess.com or all the games played between amateurs. Typically these games are expert, master, and above only. So in that case, knight f6 is the most common reply to d4. But again, it guards e4. If you're black, that's one of the main concepts that you can easily keep in mind, and should. It will benefit you. Try to control e4. White wants to play e4. That's the main reason e4 is popular, is because if you already have played e4, then it's easier to play d4 than if you play d4 first, because the queen guards d4 when the pawn comes out. Nothing guards this e4 pawn when it comes out. So here we have d5. Now a lot of people watching this are people who have almost all of their experience in openings that start with e4 from white and black answering it with e5. So this is different. This also creates what is called a ram. A ram is where two pawns are on the same file with no squares between them. Both pawns are blockading their counterpart. So neither of these pawns can move until a capture is possible. That means that either side can create a lever by moving the e pawn or the c pawn, especially if they are in a position to sacrifice a pawn or to recover the pawn once captured. They can force a file open. For instance, this lever is very popular, a very common move by white. You can see it's the most popular move up here. 128,000 versus 48,000. But again, these statistics shouldn't mean very much to us unless they're really severely skewed, like this one over here. Now a strong player could beat you with this gambit, but if I make that move, a computer will say that black is winning. So also, just like these numbers here, what a computer says are not very important unless the evaluation has an absolute value greater than, say, 0.7. If you don't know what I'm talking about there, don't worry about it. It's not going to help you yet. Now, we said that this is the most popular move of white. However, when we get to this position, even though this is the most popular move for white's second move, white may make other second moves, like knight f3 is popular here. Players who want to play c4 don't usually go for the Trompowsky or the Torre attack or the Kali system. Well, they're not going to play this move. Now, if you don't know what those openings are, they will be explained later on, but basically those are openings where white either doesn't bother to break in the center with e4, or he gets his bishop out and he creates a pawn structure with his pawns on black squares in this triangle-like arrangement. Okay, so pretty much the rest of this discussion will be about the Queen's Gambit. This is the Queen's Gambit. Now it really should be called the Queen's Bishop's Pawn Gambit, because he's gambiting a pawn here, not his queen, but nonetheless I didn't name this opening. It's called the Queen's Gambit. It's not a true gambit, and what that means is white does not intend to simply take as compensation for his losing a pawn extra development, as often happens in open game, e4, e5 openings. No, in closed games, this is only a sham sacrifice. White will easily recover the pawn. Now, you notice among the top moves, c6 or e6 or pawn takes pawn here, that by far this is the least popular move among strong players, but it is a playable move. Black can play that, and it's not a mistake. It's just that it would be a mistake if he plays it with the idea of trying to stay a pawn ahead. First of all, the pawn's leaving the control of the center, so that's something against it already. C6 or E6 is a good move. This old saw is not playable. Some people play the Chigorin, which is allegedly playable, but I wonder how come no masters ever play it. Might be good for a speed game against a 1400 player, but the only three moves I would recommend here are E6 or C6 or the accepted. But if you play the accepted as black, you have to know it well, and you have to be prepared for white's onrush in the center, which will certainly come as soon as you leave E4 unguarded. So let's suppose black takes it. Now, first of all, white can easily recover that pawn in two moves. If you don't know chess openings at all or closed openings at all, still just basic tactics, any place from which a piece can give check, it is as though there is another copy of that piece already there. Which white piece can give check? This queen. The queen could go here and also at the same time attack this unguarded pawn. So if all white wanted to do was to get the pawn back, he could go here, and black doesn't have any way of stopping the check that will enable him to recover the pawn after we finish. If he goes here with the knight, idea being to just take this, he could just do this and bring an extra attacker to the pawn and defend this pawn, and now there's certainly no way for black to defend this c4 pawn. So after that, the c pawn will be blocked, and that brings me to another very important thing to say before white's second move, is that in queen pawn openings, these pawns are guarded, unlike e4, e5 openings. In the e4, e5 openings, both center pawns are all three things. One, they're immobile, they're blockaded. Number two, they're unguarded. And number three, they are in an effective spot. So if you're a soldier in an effective position, but you are immobile, that's not good, especially if you're unguarded. And that's why the king pawns disappear. That's why we get an open E file often, or one side has a E and one side has a D file. And it's very important to have quantity of development. Here, because these pawns are stuck, these E pawns are not going to go all the way up. They're only going to go one square up, like this, and these knights are going to end up here. So even when white delays in getting this move in, still these D pawns are going to be very solid. For either side to attack with the knight is just ridiculous, because it's their C pawn that's going to have to break. They don't have enough power to make the E pawn go ahead. So it's a very common thing in double queen pawn openings to see somebody take their queen's knight and block their C pawn with it. Remember not to do that. When you're playing against E4, it is either your C pawn or your E pawn that's going to have to break there, and you're going to have as many pieces guarding that square as your opponent has attacking it most of the time, because it's rarely worthwhile as a sacrifice if your opponent is developing pieces. So let's go back, and white plays C4. This is the Queen's Gambit. So we have the Queen's Gambit declined, where he doesn't take it by playing E6 or C6. I'm not going to discuss these strange moves because they just don't happen very often, and the first thing you need to learn are the moves that are not strange. Now, if you're the white pieces, you might want to just be aware of some of the traps that can occur with this move. Also, you may want to find out about some of the traps of this similar move, but you won't find it in this video today. Okay, So, in this position, to play the Cambridge Springs, black would play here. This is a common move, but it blocks the bishop in. One alternative to that black has is to go here, and I'm going to be discussing that in a minute. But this section here where I've gone to chess.com to check out the statistics, even though I've told you the statistics are not too popular, I'm just showing you that these games are popular at higher levels, so you'll have games to study, and they're not bad. There's nothing wrong with playing d4. Nothing really wrong with accepting the gambit either, but in particular, two things I hope you remember about queen pawn openings. Don't block your c-pawn with your queen's knight, and don't try to win a pawn and then stay a pawn ahead there. That should not be expected to work. This is called the Slav, and I'll discuss this a little bit later in the video as well. And then we have the main lines of the Queen's Gambit declined. Okay. So, from there, let's take a look at what the main lines are here. When they take, nobody moves the queen out here and checks and recovers the pawn with the queen. Yeah, they could do that, but if no good players do that, it means that they have a reason in their mind for not doing that. They don't think it's a good move, and I don't think it's a good move. I can see minor pieces coming to attack the queen and win tempos from it. You're going to end up getting that pawn back after this move and eventually playing bishop takes pawn. But this is what you should do as white. If black takes a pawn, you're going to go knight f3. So if you're the black pieces, you need to be ready to see that move. Okay, so black usually goes here. Now, the reason for this a6 move would be to try to play b5. But let's just say, for whatever reason, black tries to stay a pawn ahead. So we'll say that white goes ahead and he plays e3 here. And you can see that Stockfish at a depth of 41 and these other engines here all suggested e3 on the previous move. So Stockfish at a depth of 47, e3, 42, e3, 27, e3. Very, very early in the game, we don't much care what the engines say because they don't look far enough ahead to be as effective as human experience if it's in the first 5 or 6 moves of the game. However, if the computer finds a move that it thinks is real good, it's usually because of tactics, and then usually we can rely on it. Okay, so he's played here a6 instead of knight f6. White now plays e3. Yes, it does block off his bishop, but now, because we have this closed D and E file here by white, his bishop's going to take here, and so white has an open C file. He's going to castle on the king side. If need be, after taking the pawn, his bishop will go here. But if black tries to stay a pawn ahead, it should not work. So let's see, in the regular line, white just takes this back right away. So let's suppose he tries to save it. Notice that this move, it doesn't appear as the top 3 with any of the engines, and it's not any of the top 4 on Fritz 16 here. But we'll say he goes here. He's trying to guard this pawn. Now, take a moment and see what you think is best. Yep. A4. A4 is what white should do. He plays here. Now notice that the black rook is not guarded. Not guarded at all, right? So this means that white is threatening to take this pawn, and if black takes back with his pawn, then the rook on A1 will take his rook. If black takes, because it is his move, white takes back, check, and wins this pawn with the bishop getting another piece out as well. Unless, of course, he attacks the queen, then he'll move his queen to take it. Either way, he's got moves like this coming, or he could do that this way. And white not only has his piece back, but he's ahead on development, and these pawns of black's are very weak. And his whole king side is undeveloped. So, what else can black try after b5? Let's say he plays b5 again. Okay, and we play a4 again. He could try to guard it this way, but now white will take. He can't take with the a pawn because of rook takes rook, so he takes with this pawn, and now he does this. Can you guess what white should do if black goes pawn takes pawn? Well, it wouldn't be hard. Look at all checks and captures. Check. If the pawn takes, he loses his rook. Meanwhile, the queen's ready to take this, and if the pawn moves forward, the bishop can take it. Okay, so he can't exactly do that. Let's see, how desperate could he be? Let's say he goes here to try to guard the rook and guard this pawn. Now white will take it. Of course, the queen can't take back. If he takes this way, well, we could easily enough play queen a4 check and win the pawn back. We can even just do this, and the queen is just not going to be happy looking for a way to try to save the pawn. So no matter what black does, no matter what he does, that pawn is going to fall of black's. But if black tries too hard to save it, he's going to end up making too many pawn moves. He'll typically weaken this long diagonal. Sometimes the queen goes to f3 to win the rook. It's just not a smart thing for black to try to do. So this is why I would recommend c6 or e6. So let's take a look first at c6. It's not really a bad move for black at all. Caro-Kann players like to play this move. Now, if you don't know what that is, pretend I didn't say it. But see, the Caro-Kann is where black plays c6 answering e4 and gets a similar pawn structure. However, he doesn't usually have the opportunity to capture the c4 pawn. As white, you want to get your knight here because it can go to e5 and attack f7 and guards c4 at the same time, develops a piece. It might take a little longer now for white to develop his queen side because he might play e3 quickly. So it's good to get these kingside pieces out. As soon as he gets this bishop out, he'll castle. Sometimes, even with this arrangement, white will play g3 and then move his bishop to g2, create a fianchetto, what we might call a Catalan. This is black's best to go here. So we did this, 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 and this, and then the two knights came out. So now he brings the other knight out. He's still not really threatening to win a pawn. He's got 2 against 3. Now he goes here. If white wants to pin the knight, the time is now before he moves his pawn up. And this is one good move that black can do. That would kind of make him go here. I have another video coming soon where I'm going to discuss this move in a lot more detail. It can lead to something called the Cambridge Springs after e3 and queen a5. See, this move breaks a pin and makes a pin at the same time. And it's very easy to go wrong here. Look at this evaluation, how it's only 0.24. That's a very normal number, black with a tiny advantage. However, there's a very normal looking developing move here that it really is a blunder. Watch how much the evaluation changes when I make this very normal looking move. All of a sudden, black is better. So, he can go here right away. Now, if I take with my bishop, he takes back with the pawn and he's threatening the knight, and the queen will also be threatening the bishop. Of course, white cannot take with the knight. Another thing that black could do is he can go here. Now, a lot of people here would just go ahead and take the pawn. You have to trade here. If you take this pawn instead, now knight e4 makes a big problem for white because you're threatening to win pieces here and you're also threatening to win pieces here. The best white can do is to save this, and then on knight takes c3, you can take back, and then if the queen takes here with check, notice it's attacking the rook and the bishop also. You take and move this knight in the way, and white has a queen, 2 rooks, 3 pieces. Black has a queen, 2 rook, and 3 pieces. Black is a pawn ahead, but what? What does white have for the pawn? You got it, a lot of development. He's going to castle on his next move, and he's pretty fully developed, where black, this bishop can't even begin to get out. Black has really got to strive for one of those key freeing moves like e5 or c5 here, guarded by the knight and bishop, and then to take here and bring his rook to the c file and try to cause trouble. So another way, of course, that that this can go after knight f6 is if he can play e3 immediately, which is not a bad move, even though it blocks this bishop back in. This bishop might want to hang out here and help guard the king. It immediately guards this square. Some people like to go here right away, but now that unguards this. However, my knight is not already there. And the difference that makes is if my knight was already there, that would make queen b3 all the stronger. When you're the black pieces, getting your queen's bishop into the game is sometimes a problem. And now he goes here. where this is even better guarded. That makes queen b3 not all that dangerous for black. Now in other videos I'm going to go into a lot more detail about how to play these, but they should be one at a time. Here is e6, and this is a common way for him to play. Knight f6. Now white often on the previous move or even on this move likes to play g3. Notice it doesn't happen so much from this position. In this position, when he plays this, it's not always clear where his other pieces are going to go, but in particular this dark squared bishop. But it is obvious that this bishop's not going to directly defend c4 if it goes to g2. So that might look like this. And notice how white seems unconcerned with winning that pawn. And I don't really like the knight move in front of the c pawn. And I would rather be the white pieces here. Black so far has remained a pawn ahead, but now white starts to get a very strong center in compensation for it. So naturally this is not the kind of opening like king pawn openings, which are very sharp and forcing. This is more almost like a system opening for both sides. That is, they're going to end up making 3 or 4 moves in almost any move order, and their pieces are pretty much headed for certain very predictable squares. Like this bishop is either going to go pin a knight or it's going to stay put. This pawn will likely go here. Both of the knights are almost certain to go here. 90% of the time this bishop will go to d3. Every once in a while he'll fianchetto it. For black, we know that most likely his knights are going to go to d7 and f6, especially if he moves this up just one. Sometimes the queen's bishop will fianchetto. Black almost always castles on the king side, and his dark square bishop will either stop a pin or create a pin of its own. So, knight c3, definitely most popular. There is an opening black can play where he goes here now just to keep white from moving the bishop out. I don't see the actual real sense of that because black doesn't really mind getting a bishop for a knight, but it'll avoid some variations. Notice here, white might just go here anyway. Now when he goes here, the bishop keeps the pin. He castles e3, which stops an eventual f4, which might trap this bishop. Now that black is castled over here, I think you know that it's very risky to play g5. Whenever somebody does this, consider sacrificing the knight, consider sacrificing the bishop, and so on. If you can bring more additional pieces, especially including the queen, over to the king side. Otherwise, it might not matter. But this is a very, whether you're white or black, if this happens, you need to spend a lot of time on the clock. One side needs to see if they can checkmate the king soon because of it. And this player should have thought long and hard about that before they do it. When you move these pawns in front of your king, it is potentially very dangerous. But in closed openings, especially if one of the bishops is exchanged away, we may have an exception. And this is his way of getting this bishop out because he can't move this pawn here anytime soon. So this bishop is going to go here and add its weight to e4. It made it all the way across the center, so that's far enough. Bishop e2, bishop to b7, and now he takes, and he takes. And after this trade, white has an open c file to work with. His bishop still is not real happy, but it's happy enough because it has its influence on e4 with the pawn. Black has this open E file to work with, where white has the C file to work with. But this is perfectly good for black here. So let's see what else gets played here often. On C6, after this and this, we'll often see this move. Yeah, that was actually the main line. This creates something called the semi-Slav, because he's got both these pawns and the knight here. With bishop to g5, this could also take us into the Cambridge Springs. For instance, if instead of h6, if he played knight bd7 right away, and then e3, now queen a5 is right at the top of the list. This is the Cambridge Springs. And again, as you saw, just doing this opens the queen to this bishop. So white will often trade this bishop just so that there's nothing to take there. The other thing white will often do is he will bring this knight back to d2 to break the pin along here. And he doesn't normally initiate the trade there himself. Notice bishop d3 gets a question mark. Here's the main line to go here. White kind of likes to keep his bishop pair these days. If black goes here, I think you see why white might be concerned about that, because now the queen is ready to take this bishop, and after this knight moved here, he's not guarding it anymore. So you can't just take back and let him take your piece. So white would trade here. He's going to take back with the knight, and then strangely he takes with the knight. Not so strange, because black has to be very careful where he goes with that queen, and he cannot get a new piece out here. So he goes back here, and this treats the pawn structure and the queen placement in a way pretty similar to the Caro-Kann. But notice black still needs to get c5 or e5 in when he can. It'll probably be c5. Rook c1 with his rook on the same file as the queen. Bishop e7. And now he decides to fianchetto his bishop, which he does. Rook to d8. He castles. Bishop d7, queen e2, and now he's guarding his knight. He may get a chance to go here and or here. He can put this bishop here in the middle. Now, it would take you all day long to memorize a bunch of long games from this opening, but it might be worthwhile for you to see a few games from the Queen's Gambit. There are also many good YouTube videos on the Queen's Gambit here, like this one. And I hope later on you'll look for my video on the Cambridge Springs defense. Thanks for listening.